when you saw the U.S. for the second time engage Iran militarily, did you think of Venezuela all over again?
It felt different. I mean, partly this feels a lot more violent than Venezuela. The other piece of it, which is really unique, which I think people haven't paid enough attention to, is we're working side by side with Israel. We have another partner. We're working more closely with Israel than we worked with any other country on a military operation since World War II. Venezuela was all about us. This operation in Iran is with a partner who we have never operated with before and are now operating with incredibly closely.
Well, I think that the similarities are there, but the differences, I think, are greater. The Venezuela operation was 2 hours, right? We were in and out. There was a very limited mission in Venezuela. I likened it to these kinds of cancerous cells you're trying to go in and just remove through a very surgical operation. It strikes me that the ambition in Iran and the scope and the scale is just so much larger.
And part of me wonders how much of that is because of the U.S. preference and how much of it is the Israeli preference. I mean, the Israelis are really serious about creating the conditions for the downfall of the regime, not just the leadership, but the regime. Venezuela, we haven't really seen the U.S. pushing for the downfall of the regime.
That's right, John. We have a kind of a rump Maduro regime still running the show in Venezuela. The difference is that the U.S. has this massive apparatus of leverage and is trying to get the policies that it wants to see out of the regime while still maintaining most of the personnel. I wonder whether the Israelis or even the U.S. would be happy with an analog in Iran of the same type.
I could imagine President Trump saying, you know, either the economic cost, the political cost, the mood's changed, this would be okay for now. There are so many U.S. goals in Iran that the president could say, we destroyed the ballistic missile capability, we destroyed the nuclear program, we're just going to go home. I think from an Israeli perspective, much more problematic. I think they are really committed to regime change, to real regime change, although in reality, both the United States and Israel, I think, would be okay with a sort of smoking Iran, an Iran that doesn't really have a central government. The challenge there is what countries in the neighborhood think about that, because they're going to have to live next to a smoldering Iran without a central government.
I think that's one of the key differences, John, here as well between Venezuela and Iran is in Venezuela you had a very specific mission and the end goals were very well stated. You may disagree with them, you may agree with them, but the end goals were very well stated. We didn't have this challenge in Venezuela where there were multiple stated goals as there has been in Iran. First it was about the protesters, then it was about the ballistic missiles, then it went to the nuclear ambitions of the Iranian regime, and then it went back again, right? We don't have that in Venezuela. It was specifically about one man who was seen as the problem to moving the situation forward in Venezuela.
Where's the neighborhood stand on Venezuela? Are they relieved? Are they anxious? What do they think about what this tells them about U.S. power?
A huge sigh of relief, John, surprisingly, and it caught many of us by surprise as Latin Americanists. We are conditioned to believe that U.S. power projection and U.S. exercise of power in the region is going to create blowback. There were some wonderful polls done by Bloomberg which actually show that the operation was more popular in Latin America than it was in the United States.
That's amazing.
And in Venezuela, it had 80 or 90% approval. And the lowest country that was polled was Mexico, where there was about 50 or 51% approval. So broad majorities of Latin Americans happy to see Maduro go, happy for Venezuelans to potentially have that new day, that chance for a reset. I think the only way you can interpret this is Maduro was a classic case of a guy who had overstayed his welcome.
Which is interesting because I think from a Gulf Arab point of view, there's first the sense that they're going to be affected. They're the ones who the Iranians can reach. They're in the splash zone, so to speak. But there's also a sense that the real problem with Iran isn't the Islamic Republic or its government. The real problem with Iran is 92 million Persians standing above them, looking to overwhelm them. That's a problem that doesn't go away if the government falls. I think the U.S. perspective, the Israeli perspective, it's all about this government. From the neighbor's perspective, the problem is we're always going to need an outside balancer against the Persians. I think from a regional perspective, the real challenge is if the United States becomes not a force for stability, but a force for instability in the region, who's the guarantor? But it sounds to me like folks in Latin America think the U.S. is still the guarantor, maybe even more the guarantor, because we're focused on Latin America in a way we haven't been in the past.
I would say that there really isn't another option. The U.S. is the dominant power in the Western Hemisphere, and other countries that have had geopolitical ambitions and rhetoric focused on providing regional goods and stability haven't been up to the task. And indeed, for a few months in the Biden administration, after the stolen election, the Biden folks allowed the Brazilians to try to lead an effort to resolve the electoral impasse with Maduro in Venezuela. And what the Brazilians weren't able to do is they weren't even able to get Maduro to come onto a Zoom call to have a conversation.
That's a low bar.
About, this is a low bar, John. This is a low bar, right? They couldn't get him to come on a Zoom call. And so then the U.S. comes in over the top and uses U.S. power to resolve the problem and actually captures Maduro in the dead of night, and the next morning we wake up to a new reality. If you are Brazil, that's a devastating blow to your worldview for the last 20 years and to the rhetoric and belief that you have in your capability to offer real public goods and to solve difficult regional challenges.
You know, I think from a Middle East perspective, a country like Saudi Arabia, which sees itself as a regional power, sees itself as a fraction of the size of Iran, and never really thought it was going to be able to stand up to Iran. The interesting thing, of course, and there's no analog like this in Latin America, but Israel, a relatively smaller country, does see itself as a superpower, and for Israel to align with the United States on an operation like this, from an Israeli perspective, changes the entire strategic balance in the Middle East. I think from an Arab perspective, very distressing, because, of course, the U.S. hasn't operated with Israel, partly because of Arab suspicion of Israel, animus toward Israel. Mm-hmm. How this all plays out, and if it all goes sideways, I think could have a really lasting effect on the U.S. reputation in the Middle East. Is Venezuela the same thing? Is there a sense that if things go wrong in Venezuela, you think people start looking askance at the United States and say, what are these guys doing? They're just making a mess.
It's possible, although I feel like the region is still very positive about the potential that this reset moment has for Venezuela. There's something that you mentioned, John, which I think is really interesting, which is even if you get rid of the Islamic Republic, you still have the geopolitical ambitions of Iran in the Middle East, and that's a challenge that needs to be managed by an outside power. We don't have an analog in Latin America. Venezuela never had the kinds of geopolitical ambitions that you're talking about, the Iranians having and needing to be managed. Venezuela was more a challenge of being a kind of beachhead for a lot of these countries, China, Russia, Iran, even Cuba, to kind of project power throughout the region or to have a platform in the U.S. shared neighborhood. But the geopolitical ambitions were never there, the same way, I think, for the Iranian regime.
You've thought a lot about Venezuela and Iran. Did you have any sense that the Iranians were looking at Venezuela and started to take some lessons from it? Did you see any evidence of that?
I actually think the 12-day war in June of last year was one of the lessons for Venezuela. Actually, it's so in the opposite direction. Because the Venezuelans saw very clearly that the Iranians asked for help. Where were the Russians? Where were the Chinese? Where were the regimes that they banked on in the most existential of questions, which is regime security? Yeah. And if those folks aren't there to answer the most existential call you can make, which is about your regime security, what other good are they if they offer benefits during peacetime but not in your moment of most dire need? And that actually played out again in Maduro's fate. Starting in October of 2025, he started sending letters to Xi, to Putin, even to the Iranians to say, I need your help. And he wasn't asking for troops. He wasn't asking for these countries to put real skin in the game to help him defend himself. He asked for additional training on some of the Russian air defense systems, on the Chinese radars. He asked for additional stockpiles of materials. And in many ways, his missives were left unanswered. And I think the lesson was learned in Iran, and then it repeated itself in Venezuela. John, let me ask you, do you think that there is an analog to Venezuela in terms of how the Trump administration could see this ending? Is there a rump Iranian regime that we could work with, someone who's maybe more technocratic or supposedly more pragmatic and open to working with the United States, a Delcy Rodriguez of Iran, if you will?
I could imagine there being a Delcy Rodriguez-like character in Iran who's acceptable to the United States. It's harder for me to imagine one who's acceptable to Israel. The challenge that we have in Iran is all the guys with guns and money and an organization are the bad guys. And they're all networked, and it's hard to beat something with nothing. These are also not only people who've been sort of ideologically oriented the same way for a long time, but all their profits come from sanctions busting. They have an interest in sustaining, and have had an interest in sustaining, animosity between Iran and the United States. The Israelis are much more interested in a genuine regime change, but to my mind as well, I think the United States is more interested in limiting this because there is a lot of political pressure not to be engaged in forever wars in the Middle East. The Israelis think they don't have a choice except to be engaged in forever wars in the Middle East. The only way out of it is really changing the nature of the Islamic Republic, changing the nature of the government of Iran. So I don't think now we're going to have that split, but I could see that split emerging in week, 2 week, 3 weeks, where the U.S. is keen to find a Delcy Rodriguez or somebody acceptable, and the Israelis say, whoa, 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 we're not done.
So let me follow up then. What do you think the Israelis took away from the Venezuela lesson, if it wasn't the lesson about regime change that you just said? Because for me, I would have expected that they would take away the lesson that the U.S. isn't interested in doing full regime change. Look at what happened in Venezuela. That was 1 or 2 people who we were interested in removing, and we left a rump regime in place, and now we're using our coercive tools at our disposal to get the policies that we want.
The lesson the Israelis took away from Venezuela is we finally have an American president who's willing to roll the dice. Wow. That's what we need. We've always had American presidents. They're too tentative. They want to go through a big bureaucratic process. They're all concerned. Netanyahu's perception is that he rolled the dice any number of times in the Gaza war, any number of times attacking Hezbollah and exploding the pagers and everything else. And now they have a president who was willing to operate with Israel and bomb the nuclear facilities in joint operations, willing to go in with Israel to really try to change this regime. I think what they took from Venezuela is they had finally a president who's willing to roll the dice after generations of presidents who were much more tentative than Israelis think is appropriate in the Middle East.
It's fascinating.